So the intermittent fasting. One thing that's interesting is is we talked briefly about the accumulation of waste products in our cells, which include misfolded proteins, just all of this stuff that just sits there and damages our chromosome and sort of impairs general metabolism and leads to increased inflammation. And so what we want to do is to try to recycle that garbage. And one way to do that is by not eating. Now, most of us like to eat.
Yes.
And in fact, I like to eat. But so the intermittent fasting is a way to sort of recycle the garbage and turn down the insulin and do all these other things without necessarily having to change what you're eating, although changing what you're eating helps, but just changing when you're eating. And
George, I didn't want to interrupt, but I know a lot of people, when I mention intermittent fasting, they think, oh, I have to fast for days, or I have to fast, but that's not what you're talking about.
That's not what we're talking about. And in fact, the person I share an office with, practicing medicine, had information on fasting, and I always said, I can't do that. And we had a good friend who did a 24-hour fast 2 or 3 days a week, but then he wouldn't eat supper with his wife. And I just thought, no, I have to eat supper with my wife. And so I thought that, okay, how do I do this? And so there's a lot of talk now about the 16-8 fasting, where you limit your eating to an 8-hour period, which is flexible, and which means that you fast for 16 hours. And so what most of the people I've talked to, most of my patients, say that, I ask them, do you eat breakfast? And they say, they're ashamed. They say, no, thinking that that's the wrong thing. And I say, oh, terrific. That's the right answer. Because breakfast is not the most important meal. Although when people say, oh, I love breakfast, I have to eat breakfast, then what I tell people is, okay, then let's try to work around this. Many of us who skip breakfast, but you can still have coffee, you can still have tea, you can have decaf, you can even, and fat does not break your fast. So I still, I take Carlson's fish oil every morning. I take a couple of soup spoons of that to give me my omega-3s. And then I put a little bit of organic heavy cream in my coffee. Why? Because I like that.
Yes.
I'm not saying it's healthy. And I know many people who have become vegan, and so they will not do that. Some people, you can put just a little bit of almond milk. Almond milk is very, very low in both carbohydrates and in protein, so that likely will be okay. So, but you skip breakfast, but you can still have coffee, and you try to stay busy until lunch. And then you have a good, healthy lunch. I usually have salad with some chicken on it and a little bit of olive oil with maybe ranch dressing. And then when I get home, I might have a handful of nuts. And then I try to eat dinner ending around 8 p.m. So I've eaten within an 8-hour period. And from 8 until noon the next day, I'm fasting. And doing this, and particularly trying to limit the carbohydrates, I will be in small, trace to small ketosis in the morning. And by lunchtime, I'm in small to moderate ketosis. And we'll talk about how ketosis, in fact, can be a healing state. Now, if you want to eat breakfast, then what you do is you can either eat your breakfast and try to finish an evening and a late day meal at 4 p.m., or what people tend to do is start eating at 10 and finish by 6, which is a window that's actually a reasonable window, because then you get home at 5, you can eat by 6, and then you still have the 16-hour fast. Now, some days, particularly when I'm not in the office, I'll skip breakfast and I'll skip lunch, and then you have a 20-hour fast. And what happens at 16 hours is your human growth hormone goes up. At 20 hours, it goes up exponentially. So, in fact, it's really interesting that human growth hormone is associated with increased, they're doing studies now and giving, in animal models, giving human growth hormone actually increases longevity. So, and there are studies ongoing giving people human growth hormone, but that is also a promoter of cancer. So I personally would rather try to do this as naturally as possible.
Yes.
And so I try to do the 20-hour fasting.
I had a client I worked with for a while that wanted to do the human growth hormone drops, correct? And she lost weight.
Mm-hmm.
But once she stopped with the drops, she gained it back. And then she wanted to do it again, which I was not a big supporter of. But what you're saying sounds like a natural way
of boosting it.
Yes.
Because I think that it, I do trust our bodies to do the right thing if we give them the opportunity to do the right thing. And I think that it is remarkable how the body can heal and, in fact, can grow younger and stronger. And I think animals, the way animals live is oftentimes the way are sort of telling us how best to move forward. So I think it's interesting.
Yes.
So the intermittent fasting. This is an option for those of us who don't like green leafy vegetables. And I have patients who, they look at me and they say, Doc, I hate broccoli. Brussels sprouts make me sick. Okra, are you kidding me? It's like, and kale is rabbit food. But they'll eat corn and potatoes, and they call those vegetables. And it's like, of course, those are better known as starches. And so what we want to do is to give the people who will really not necessarily want to, live on rabbit food with healthy oils and a little bit of protein. But is there another way that they can become healthy? Less dependent on what they're eating, but perhaps more dependent on when they're eating.
Yes.
So I think that if we go through these things, I think we'll find that the intermittent fasting, what's interesting about this is when you don't eat, your body basically goes into this protective mode. And the first thing that happens is your insulin level drops. And then your human growth hormone goes up. You can discount it. And people have always been told that if you're not eating, your body shuts down. But in fact, the most recent evidence is at least it's level, and it may even increase to a small extent. And then by reducing reducing the insulin levels, you see reduction, in the fasting state, reduced oxidative stress and reduced inflammation. So I think that and this is the opportunity for the body to clean house. That in fact, if you're not eating, your body still requires, in women, requires 1,200 calories per day, and in men requires 1,800 calories, even if you're just sitting and sleeping. And so your body has to continue to work. So what it does is it begins to do what's called autophagy, which is eating itself. And you think, well, is that really good for me? But you see, the body is smart. It eats the damaged stuff first.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so the first thing it does is it goes into the cells and it takes all those misfolded proteins and all the other garbage that's just been, laying around, and it turns that into energy, into, the mitochondria take those substances and turn them into, chemical energy, ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which we use to run our muscles, to run our brain, to run everything. And then what happens is also it turns on the cellular repair mechanism where you're taking the damaged cells and either fixing them or just having them undergo what's called apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. We're going to talk about the mitochondria in a bit. The mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell, controls when cells live and die. And so some people actually refer to them as the CPU of the cell, the central processing unit, that in fact it's the brain. So these little old, what were once microbes that work together with our primitive, the very primitive cells into turning them into eukaryotic cells, which are the more modern cells that can use oxidative phosphorylation, which is much more efficient than fermentation. We're going to go over this a little bit more when we talk about ketosis and cancer. But in doing all this, you reduce the inflammation, and all of your heart disease risk factors decrease as well. Your LDL drops, your HDL goes up, your particle size, the LDL particle size, which is related to heart disease, instead of being small, dense, which is very atherogenic, become large and fluffy, which what scares some people is when you're fasting, your cholesterol actually goes up. But there's something called reverse cholesterol transport, where it's actually taking the cholesterol from your body, these large fluffy LDL, taking it back to the liver and reprocessing it. So in fact, you're recycling the cholesterol out of your blood vessels back to the liver by fasting, which I just think is, it is amazing that how important fasting is.
Yes.
And then the risk factors for cancer. Insulin is basically insulin and excess calories, and particularly cancer cells, because the mitochondria controls programmed cell death, and cancer wants to live forever. Not that they're thinking that way, but that's just the way the cells grow. They actually, a lot of the cancer genes code for processes that shut the mitochondria down. And cancers most cancers can consume primarily sugar, not the ketone bodies that we'll talk about. But so if you're reducing the sugar by intermittent fasting, your cancer risk factors go down as well. And then brain neurotrophic hormone. So I was told in medical school that you cannot regrow your brain. But in fact, there's a fellow out in California, Dr. Bredesen, who has an ongoing study where people basically, it's a multi-pronged study where intervention, where you're basically eating the Mediterranean hunter-gatherer-like diet. You're doing interval exercise to where you're breaking a sweat. You're doing meditation, yoga, and taking a few supplements. And what he's shown is that in these people who have mild cognitive impairment, mild to even moderate cognitive impairment, with MRIs showing that their hippocampus, which is the part of the base of the brain, which is kind of the seat of the soul, which on MRI was down to the 15th percentile, the people who were successfully moving forward in the program would regrow their hippocampus to where they would get back up to 75, 80, 85%, 85th percentile, which is pretty close toward normal. And the neuroradiologists who were reading the MRI said these MRIs are mislabeled because they'd never seen that before.
Oh my goodness!
And so so in fact you can regrow your brain. Wow. And that what we're doing, the intermittent fasting does that, as well as the interval exercise, which is another thing that will stimulate our mitochondria. So the optimal nutrition, all of that. And then, in animal studies, they've shown that the fasting what they do in these studies, unfortunately for the animals, is they will expose them to neurotoxins, and that if they're in the fasting state, it protects them against the neurodegenerative effects of the neurotoxins. And then the protective state of cells, I think what's the most remarkable thing is recently a friend of ours brought over an MIT journal magazine that had a whole series of articles on aging. And so I was reading that, and I was most amazed by this one that was talking about Professor Longo, who's out west someplace. I can't remember where he's located, but he's been studying, probably in Arizona, I guess, because he'd been studying calorie restriction for 40 years. His mentor was the physician who was in Biosphere 2, which is where it's a dome in Arizona, a sealed environment where it's about 3 acres. And this team of scientists went in and lived for 2 years, growing all their food. They had chickens and etc. But in fact, they could not grow enough food. So this was an experiment in calorie nutrition. And calorie restriction with optimal nutrition seems to be healthy. But they did not have optimal nutrition. So in fact, it didn't work out that well. That in fact, they did not come out healthier because they were lacking many nutrients,
Right.
which in fact was not a good thing. But then subsequent to that, so they've been looking at this, but he did a study where they took worms and they put one into a nutrient, usual nutrient environment and one into a nutrient deficient environment, and then exposed both groups to toxic doses of doxorubicin, also known as adriamycin, which is part of the CHOP therapy for lymphoma, the CHOP therapy, and all of the fed worms died, and the fasting worms survived. And so they did that again in a mice study, where they took 2 groups of mice, randomized. One was fed the standard amount of mouse chow, and the other ones were actually fasted for 60 hours, which is, a long time for a mouse.
Yes.
And then they gave all the mice lethal doses of this doxorubicin. All of the well-fed mice died, 100%. None of the fasting mice died, and they were shocked.
Wow.
And they went to the oncologist and said, look, you could protect your patients from the adverse effects of the chemotherapy, because they showed that the cells just went into this protective state. And that the cancer cells, because they're de-differentiated, meaning they've gone back to being primitive,
Right.
Cannot get into a protective state. So when you fast, you're not only starving the cancer, but you're basically protecting the normal cells. They go into this protective state. You hit it with chemotherapy, and now you've got this cancer that's like totally stressed out. You just hit it, and it'll be like the well-fed mice. They will all die, and your cells will live. So so I think that
Wow.
this whole intermittent fasting thing is just fascinating.
It is.
So we're going to talk more about that. But do you really want cancer patients to not eat?
Right.
And so the answer is no. So what we need to do, you really want them continuing to get adequate calories, because they need to support their bodies, because they're losing weight anyway.
Right.
Some of that is from the cancer just consuming huge amounts of calories in the form of. So how can we do that? And that so what we can think about is there such a thing as a fasting mimicking diet? But before we go there, I wanted to talk about, correct. The increased longevity, and therefore does hunger equal healing. And so if you ever had an animal get sick, in fact, if any animal that gets sick, what they tend to do is to crawl in a corner and not eat, not drink, and just rest.
Right.
And you think that, really? And so what happens is they go into ketosis. The ketogenic state, in fact, gives you that protective mechanism. You're clearing out all of the sort of garbage, and your immune system is empowered to sort of attack things more effectively. And that as you're burning up your body, because basically you'll be burning your fat cells, you'll be burning your muscle, you're creating energy which produces carbon dioxide and water. So in fact, you don't have to drink. Basically you can go long periods of time by just producing, so the animal can sort of subsist on where they are, and either the animal will die or they will recover. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, they could look very much like they're going into kidney failure.
Yes.
If you test their blood, but in fact, no, they can move past that because they will come back. And so I think that, and what we want is to enable our patients, particularly those with cancer, to get into that healing state, but without necessarily starving themselves. And so what we need is there a fasting mimicking diet that can sort of help people, but still maintain calories?
Yes.
And that's what we're going to talk about next.
Okay.